This is the Marketing Podcast Network.
Stories influence, teach, and inspire us. But what about the storytellers who create them? Uncorking a Story profiles storytellers to uncover how their background and life experiences influence the stories they create. We learn what motivates them, their path to success, and what fuels them to keep creating. It all starts by asking one simple question: where does your story begin? Welcome to Uncorking a Story. Now here's your host, Mike Carlin.
Well, hello and welcome to Uncorking a Story, now part of the Marketing Podcast Network. I'm your host, Mike Carlin, and today I'm very excited to introduce you to Karen Winnick. Karen is the author of more than a dozen picture books for children, most of which she illustrated. An animal lover, she serves on several boards devoted to the well-being of animals. She joins me today to talk about her life and latest book, Can You Spot the Leopard? An African Safari, which aims to teach children compassion for animals. Welcome to Uncorking a Story, Karen.
Thank you for having me, Mike. I appreciate it.
Well, it's my pleasure to have you here, Karen, and I'm curious to know, where does your story as an author begin?
I think one strong factor is that I'm an only child, and in this long history of what I've been doing, I've been told all kinds of things, but the strongest thing about me is my imagination. And I credit that with being an only child and spending a lot of time on my own.
Yeah,
and just curiosity about the world. And I would sit for hours and draw and do things on my own.
I always was amazed by people who could sit and draw and kind of fill their time. I do not have that talent. I cannot draw for the life of me. It gives me, art class used to give me tremendous anxiety as a kid. But I had a twin brother to sort of, keep me company. So that was,
and you were never quite alone.
Was never alone, sometimes wanted to be. And sometimes, now in our late 40s, if he's around too much, I get a little upset. Just kidding.
Well, I'm married to a man that likes to be with other people. And I love my friends and I love people, but I also need time alone. And it all comes back from, it all resonates from being an only child. Also, in terms of drawing, I go to schools all the time and talk to kids. And I always ask them, how many of you play sports? And they all raise their hand. And I say, well, what do you have to do to be good? And they go, practice. And I go, well, art's no different. If you want to do art, practice. If you want to write well, practice. The more you do something, even if you start at not a very good place, you get better.
And my three children are very talented with art. One in particular, Gracie, from the time she could hold, some kind of writing instrument in her hand, she's been able to pretty much draw whatever she sees.
Great.
She's naturally gifted, and she used to draw all the time, and there's paintings all over the house. But at some point in time, I can't even pinpoint when it was, probably just before puberty. Like it just stopped. Like she just stopped. Maybe she didn't stop drawing, but she stopped sharing it with us. And that always makes me a little sad when I think about it, because she's a wonderful, wonderful artist.
How old is she now?
She's 20. So we have triplets. They turned 20 this past April.
That's kind of amazing.
Yeah.
I wonder if she was exposed to something that would whet her appetite to do it again. Who knows? Yeah,
she's studying fashion, marketing and merchandising as a major. And I said, Gracie, you really should be a designer. I mean, you have that talent. And she has a whole sketchbook of like designs that she doesn't share with us. But this is not about Grace. This is about you.
Okay.
So when did you start writing? Children's books?
Okay. So first of all, when I was little, I thought I'd like to be a ballet dancer, but I was pretty clumsy, and I loved to draw. I even drew in the books I had, and I majored in art in college. I needed to earn a living, so I majored in graphic design. And I always loved English and history. And after college, I had a friend, and he had a very funny pair of shoes. I was working as an art director, but this friend had they were all different colors. And just for kicks, I decided I was going to write a story about his shoes. And it was called Happy Soles, Soles. And it was about a pair of shoes that didn't get along, but they were a pair. And it was so much fun to do. And at the time, I lived in Manhattan, and I would take my portfolio around, and I was told that publishers of children's books did not do inanimate objects. The rules have always changed. And now there's a series of books about animated crayons, but at the time, nobody wanted my shoe story. But I just had so much fun doing it. And it combined a relation to children, it combined art, it combined writing, and it could have been animals, it could have been history, it could have been things I care about. And I loved doing it. So I did another one. And ideas come from all different places. I had read Anna Karenina. Okay, this is funny. Levin was Tolstoy's alter ego, and he was a very wealthy young man, and he felt guilty about all this wealth. So he went to a hilltop, and he lay down, and he looked up at the arch of the sky, and you can call it resignation or you can call it acceptance. He knew it went far beyond. It made me think of a puppet who's trying to find out who pulls the strings. And I wrote a story, and it was called Patch and the Strings. And I took my portfolio around, and Lippincott, an old line Philadelphia publisher, published it. Sadly, Lippincott went out of business 6 months later, but the book had been read on TV by Captain Kangaroo. And
Sure.
And in those days, I drew pictures and wrote alongside the drawings. After that, my husband took a job in California, and there were really the only publisher that was there. We were moving to Los Angeles. I think it was Harcourt had a publishing house in San Diego, but an editor at Golden Books told me to look up this woman, and she was teaching writing at UCLA Extension. So when I moved to California, and I had 2 children already, and I have 3 also, but I had to do it separately.
We all can't be as efficient as me. I'm sorry.
I have 3 boys too. Okay, so I took a class, and as I said before, I would draw pictures and write underneath them. And I embarked on learning really how to write. I took on and off 14 years of writing classes, but 7 of poetry. I studied under this woman, Myra Cohn Livingston, who was a children's poet. And the tools of poetry, rhythm, rhyme, alliteration, repetition, are essential in writing picture books. And I only write picture books because I come from the art. And that took me down a whole other path. One time I was asked to interview Lawrence de Bruynhoff, the author of the Babar books, at the LA Public Library. And he drew pictures and wrote underneath, just the way I started off doing. But by the time I interviewed him, I was just writing stories and trying to get them right. And once I did, I would make a book dummy, and I'd do pencil sketches, and I have book dummies all over the place.
That story about, having a book read on Captain Kangaroo. I mean, that just brought me back to my childhood, because he was, my brother and I remember just watching him in our family room growing up. But I imagine, having a picture book read by Captain Kangaroo is akin to, a comedian being invited to do a panel discussion with Johnny Carson on the Tonight Show. You're kind of getting that seal of approval for, your target audience.
I was so excited, and I sat there with my young son watching it. It was great. But, Mike, I've been doing this a long time, and there's so many ups and there's so many bumps. And I think perseverance is super important.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, perseverance and publishing kind of go hand in hand, right? You have to,
Absolutely.
you have,
Perhaps in most things in life,
yeah,
but for sure in publishing.
yeah. And persistence, it's like those three P's are,
Absolutely. All of
um,
my writing friends have their war stories.
no, I'm sure. I'm sure. Well, what can you share with us about, Can You Spot the Leopard?
So I was involved with the Los Angeles Zoo, and I went down there to hear a lecture by a woman named Cynthia Moss, who studies elephants in Ambosali. And when she got up to speak, I was mesmerized. I, I've always loved animals, and I've especially loved elephants. And someone said to me, Karen, if you love elephants so much, you need to go on a safari. And I asked my husband, who didn't care about going on a safari. So I planned a trip. It turned out to be 4 middle-aged women and 4 kids in their 20s. I've traveled a lot since then, but I have to tell you, that was the best trip of my life. And we went on safari, and I took notes. And at the time, I was studying poetry with Myra Cohn Livingston. And I came home, and over a long period of time, I shaped those notes into poetry. And mostly, unless I sold something, I never got past making a pencil book dummy. But the pandemic and the quarantine were a sad time, but for me, they were a gift of time. I have a very busy life, and every single day, I started working on the paintings before the quarantine, but during the quarantine, I worked on these paintings every day, and I keep a picture file, and I pulled out pictures and cut them apart and put them together to create what I wanted. And some I did from actual photographs from the trip, but I just painted every day. And sometimes I did 2 paintings for one poem. It took me about a little over 2 years to do all the paintings. And that's how the book came about.
Yeah.
Through this safari. And what I hope to do, because it was such a neat experience, I hope to create the experience of a safari for kids. And that was my objective, but I do have a deeper purpose. And my deeper purpose is to teach children compassion and respect for animals. I have a little quote that I keep here that I just want to read. It's Jane Goodall, one of my heroes. Only if we understand will we care. Only if we care will we help. Only if we help shall all be saved. And I hope that children will care enough that they'll be advocates and activists. So that is my objective with this book.
Where do you suppose your love of animals come from?
I think my father loved animals, and I remember one night as a little girl, it was raining, and we found a stray dog on our property, and we brought him into the garage and dried him off and fed him. We didn't have any dog food because I didn't have a dog then, and we kept him. And then I grew up in Pennsylvania, in a suburb of Pennsylvania. I kept finding stray dogs, and my mother told me I had to find them homes. I could only keep one. But they're wondrous to me. And when you live with them, they're just amazing. I have 5 dogs.
Yeah.
And my husband keeps getting me topiaries. I have an elephant and a giraffe and a bear. So I don't bother him.
My mother.
I'm an activist. I was a 60s person, and I was hoping to do my very, very small part to make the world a better place. And the world has a lot of difficulties, and probably it always does. but I want to hopefully do my part to leave the world just a little bit better. And so I do it through children's books.
Yeah. Oh, it's wonderful. I think, yeah, I think of my own mom, who's 89 now, but she has this famous quote: "I'd never met a dog I didn't like." And she loves, I mean, she really does love dogs. And unfortunately her memory is failing, but even before she asks me how I'm doing, she will, she will say, "How are the dogs? Michael, how are your four-legged babies?" Like,
Well, I have grandchildren now, and truthfully, they come over to see the dogs.
yeah.
I'm a byproduct, but at least I get to see them.
So, in addition to the dogs in your home, any other animals?
I have a lot of fish. I have goldfish and koi and things like that, but that's pretty much it. I have a lot of stuffed animals around, but I get very involved in the animals that I write. And again, you don't know where ideas come from. I told you that Catching the Strings came from reading Tolstoy, but I went to the Santa Barbara Zoo, and at the time they had a crooked neck giraffe named Jamina. And I fell in love with her. I was feeding her. And I asked them if I could write a story about her. And I did, and I illustrated it. And that book had resonance with disabled children because despite her disability, she lived a long, full life. And then they asked me to write one about a penguin that they had named Lucky, who had a deformed foot. So I went around and spoke to children with disabilities about these two animals. One book that I did, I always love to look for a subtext. One book that I did, which is done nicely over the years, was Mr. Lincoln's Whiskers. I started out writing books about girl heroines in history because I had 3 boys and there wasn't that much about girls in history. And a young girl, this is a footnote in history, a young girl named Grace Bedell wrote a letter to Abraham Lincoln suggesting he grow whiskers. Even if she were grown up, she couldn't have voted, but she was only 11 years old. And he wrote her back and said, "Thank you for your suggestion." But when he was elected president, he took the train from Springfield, Illinois to Washington, D.C., and stopped it in upstate New York to show her that he had taken her advice. She was worried that he wouldn't be elected president because his face looked so sad. Well, in the writing, I realized that this little girl had a voice, and all kids should feel that if they had something to say, speak up. So when I go to schools and I speak about this book, I always say, if something is important, you have to give it voice. And sometimes they write letters as a project, as an exercise. And one little boy wrote to a famous basketball player and advised him on his jump shot. So kids are amazing. I just love kids, and I love animals, and I love books. And I feel so grateful that everything came together.
Yeah.
And I struggle. There are things I don't get published, and sometimes the book doesn't do well, but I get lost in the process, which is a good thing.
Has the conventional thinking changed whereby you can now write stories about inanimate objects?
Yes, I've never taken Happy Souls out of the drawer and tried to show it. Sometimes I just move on, and my experiences have informed my stories. Like I sponsored a search dog with the Search Dog Foundation. And I went there and I watched him train, and I went to his graduation and I got to name him. His name is Diesel. He's in Malinois. And so I have the book dummy. I've worked on that story. I've not shown that book around, but the things that happened to me in life, I think curiosity, and my mother taught me one important thing, that a love of learning, it should never stop.
Yeah. That's beautiful. I love the idea of of Happy Souls. I mean, I don't know why I'm just stuck on it,
So
but
maybe I should see if I can
it's
take it out.
because these shoes, they remind me of like the way you described it, like a pair of shoes that don't get along. It's like an old married couple, like they have to stick
Right.
together because they're useless without each other, you know?
Yes, yes.
They're kind of forced
They
to,
truly are.
they're forced to get along. I don't know. It's just too bad Captain Kangaroo's not around anymore to
I don't know. Maybe who knows?
actually I have a funny Captain Kangaroo story. My Aunt Peggy, so my father's brother married this woman, Peggy. Peggy's uncle was Captain Kangaroo.
Oh,
How do you like that?
oh my goodness.
I mean,
Wow.
no blood relation to me. You know, we don't.
Yeah,
You know,
but still, he's considered a relative in a way through marriage.
I guess. Didn't do me any good, but it's not all about me. I do have some questions I always like to
Sure.
ask towards the end. Pop culture kind of related, but I'm curious, Karen, when you were growing up, what were you watching on TV, if anything? What did you like to watch?
What did I like to watch? Well, I did like animal programs. Um, I thought you were going to ask me what book I love because that's an easy one.
We'll get there. We'll get there.
I'm not sure. I mean, father knows best and things like that. I guess.
But
I mean, now
did he really know best?
no, and I think some of the shows didn't even show that or Leave It to Beaver,
Yeah.
that kind of thing. But they have their downside because every family, as Tolstoy says, has their issues, and it might set up a false idea of what families really are.
Yeah, it sets up it might set you up for disappointment because especially like TV of that era, right? The golden age of TV.
Exactly.
It was so, I don't know, it was so clean. It was so simple.
Sanitized, whitewashed.
Yeah,
All those
and
expressions.
if your family didn't look like that, and if your family didn't act like that, I'd imagine, you'd be like confused, or disappointed somehow. And I think the same way about social media. We see all these people posting these idyllic lives on Facebook, on Instagram, and it's to some extent unrealistic, right? It's
But you made me think about it in terms of the TV shows of the time.
yeah.
I haven't really thought much. I don't have an opportunity to watch that much TV now. I work at night. I work whenever I can, and I do a lot of reading at night.
Did you watch because we did just go through this pandemic, and one of the bigger things during the early days of the pandemic, I'm ashamed to admit that I watched it, was Tiger King. Did you get sucked into that at all, or
No, it made me angry
I'm
because
sure.
they abuse the animals, and I get so upset.
Yeah.
I really do. I know so many people that watched it, but no,
Yeah. That
I
was
never watched it. And you know what? After that trip to Africa, I went on a lot of trips. In fact, I'm hoping to go to Borneo next year to see the orangutans. But I went to India and I went to a tiger preserve and I saw the same 4 or 5 tigers every single day.
yeah.
I mean, it's so sad. I think there are more tigers in captivity than there are in the wild. I mean, they've really made strides to help them.
Yeah.
But it's a long way. And I'm involved with a charity. I'm on the board of a charity called Wild Earth Allies. And what I've learned from that is that helping the local people to preserve their habitat and their animals is what's most important. You have to involve them. I've learned so much about this, but I can only do so little.
Well, let me ask you the question that you wanted to be asked, which was favorite book or books or author.
Okay, so my favorite children's book of all time, which I read in 3rd grade and have read innumerable times since, and I'm actually reading to my granddaughter now, was Charlotte's Web. I think that book is so brilliant. I could never kill a spider and I could never eat a pig. I love Wilbur and I love Charlotte.
Yeah.
And truthfully, my poetry teacher, there was a whole group of us that were in her poetry class, and they've gone on to be really well published poets and authors. One is Alice Schertle, who's done Little Blue Truck, and I love that book. But Charlotte's Web was great. And I liken all of Myra Cohn Livingston's students to Charlotte's little spiders, because after she passed away, we all went out into the world with her wisdom to write poetry.
That's a beautiful story. I kind of got teared up right there. Geez. Did not expect that.
I
Did not expect that, but that's just a beautiful, beautiful image. I mean, I remember it was always a big deal growing up when, you know, the animated movie Charlotte's Web would come on TV. And my brother and I would always watch it. And days before VCRs, where if you didn't see it, you didn't see it. But yeah, it does make you think of animals in a different way, even spiders. It's so funny. You talk about, you know, your husband being more of an extrovert, it sounds, and you being maybe a little bit more introverted. It's opposite in my house. I'm the extrovert. My wife is the introvert, but I'm also the guy who can't kill a spider. And when my wife sees one, she just like, boom, like will squish it. I'm like, why? Why are we killing the spider?
I take them outside.
Well,
and now my husband does too, because he knows I'll get mad if he kills it.
That was my mom too. Like she would not kill anything in the house. I mean, when we lived in South Florida and we had cockroaches, you know, they didn't get a pass, but everything else pretty much.
Well, we used to have them in Manhattan, and then we would spray and they go to our neighbor. And then when our neighbor sprayed, they come back and visit us. You know, if I have time, I want to say one other thing about children's books.
Yeah.
I always say, and I tell children this, when you write a picture book, you don't have to say she's wearing a red dress, because you draw a picture of her in a red dress. And strong verbs are important, not adjectives, because adjectives you can draw. So if you say hop, skip, and jump, you can draw those things. But when you're writing a chapter book or an adult novel, you're creating pictures with your words. And one of the most, I think, the genius at doing that was Wallace Stegner. He wrote a book called The Angle of Repose. And when I read it, I was blown away by his descriptions of the Grand Canyon, because he was painting pictures with his words. So I've tried to write 2 chapter books. They're both sitting in again, another box. And it was really difficult for me to use words when I wanted to draw pictures.
Yeah.
It's a different kind of writing.
It is. I felt that way about John Irving and his writing. It's poetic, you know, it is just.
And he has a new book.
Does he really? I haven't checked it out.
There's a new book that just came out. And I think one novel that impacted me greatly in my life was The Brothers Karamazov. Because one character, I think it was Ivan, there's a famous chapter where he argues, how could God exist if one child suffers? And as a 19-year-old idealist, you know, that book really impacted me.
No, I'm sure.
Stayed with me for many years.
Now, was that a book that you chose to read or that you had to read?
Yes, I was fascinated by Russian literature, but I could not fit it into my schedule because I had an art schedule with long art studio classes, and I had a lot of liberal arts, but I could not fit that in. So over the summer, I created a syllabus and read all these books.
That's great. I think there's a big difference in enjoying books when you choose to read them versus when you have to read them. Because I remember growing up, you know, middle school, high school, and you have to read. There's certain books that you just have to read because they're just part of the curriculum. And I'll even put Shakespeare in there, where you're kind of forced to read these plays versus seeing them acted out. And I didn't fall in love with any of it. But then when I chose to read, it was a completely different experience. I think I should probably go back to some of those high school, books that we were reading back then. I remember hating to read John Steinbeck because I had to. And who hates John Steinbeck? I did. I couldn't stand it.
And you know what? Sometimes you can't go home again. You've read a book and you liked it so much, and then when you try and read it again, it doesn't speak to you anymore.
Yeah, there's a few
I
books in my
think that
life
was
where I've
like Homeward Angel for
Mhm.
me. I remember reading it and liking it and then trying again.
How much time had passed between
Oh,
readings?
years. It goes by too quickly.
Well, it's one of those things where your worldview might be different, your experiences might be
Mhm.
different. You never
Things
you
speak
never
to you at
know.
different times.
What have you learned about yourself, through your own writing career and all these books that you've done? Have you any big insights into yourself besides the fact that you are clearly an animal lover?
I think at this point in my life, I'm just so grateful that I found my passion relatively early, and I've struggled to get my pleasure out of the process of doing it. Because when you're out in the world and you're selling it to an editor, or you're promoting it, it's not a hat that is as enjoyable for me to wear. I truly love talking to kids. I want to use this book as a platform to speak to children, to get them to love animals the way I do, or just to care about them. And I think gratitude is the biggest thing that is on my mind constantly now.
Was it hard for you during the pandemic when you couldn't go into schools and read to kids?
I did a lot of Zoom visits.
Okay.
I did.
Was
In
it the,
fact,
was it the
I
same for
didn't,
you? Did you get the same feeling, same energy out of it?
it wasn't quite the same, but I, for example, I had opportunities I know I wouldn't have had. For example, North Shore Animal Rescue, which is on Long Island, does something every month where they get an author to read, and they do a program called Mud Agrees, where they have a whole curriculum. There's one for primary school, one for secondary, to get kids to develop compassion for animals and people. And they ask authors to read. So schools all over the country I don't think they buy it. I think they get it free, this program, and use it with their school kids. So I got to do a Zoom. Fortunately, I actually did two, and I'm going to do one next year for this book, where I spoke to children all over the country in one Zoom. And I got to see some of the kids. And in some of the Zooms, I do get to see the kids, and they ask me questions. Another thing was, for about 2 years, I didn't get a cold, because sometimes a little kid comes up with green stuff hanging out of his nose and he wants to hug me and hold my hand. So I was forever getting colds.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I just love being with him. I have a school visit on Monday.
Okay.
So
Are you based in Los Angeles or
I'm based in Los Angeles,
still
yes.
in LA? It looks like it's a sunny day in LA, judging by your background.
Yeah, yeah. And it actually rained the other day, which is heaven sent.
Oof. It doesn't happen often there. I lived in
Oh, it's
Agoura Hills for
terrible.
6 months,
It's
and I
terrible.
didn't see Dunkin' Donuts, and I didn't see rain or have good pizza. Um, well, Karen, this has been fun. I do
Well,
have.
it's been great speaking with you and meeting you.
Oh, likewise, but I have one question I always like to end on, which is if you could go back in time and write your younger self a letter, or send that letter back in time to your younger self, what would you tell your younger self? Any big thoughts, big words of advice you'd tell a younger Karen?
Well, one thing, I was a good student in the subjects I liked, and there were some subjects I didn't like, so I didn't try hard. So maybe that would have been better to do that, because there's certain things like I studied French and I could never pronounce it. And um, just I mean, I feel like I'm an earnest person, and maybe it isn't so good to be so serious, but um, maybe I could have been a little more serious about certain things. And I would have liked to have kept more of the dogs I found.
Oh, well, speaking of which, I haven't seen any walking around during the course of our
Okay, hold
conversation.
on, hold
We're
on.
gonna we're gonna see some canines.
Yes. Come on, guys. Hey, everybody here, come on. Come on, Rusty. Winnie, Bella. Come on. Okay, my son keeps getting me. This is Goldie.
Goldie. Oh, sweetie pie. What's that? A King Charles Spaniel?
They're
Oh,
all.
They're all
I mean,
King Charles Spaniels?
I've had a Boston. I've had mutts in the past when I was younger. And I had a Bichon. Oh, and this is Rusty. Can you see Rusty?
Oh, yeah. I see Rusty. Oh, she's
I don't
beautiful.
think anybody else came in.
Oh, dear. Well, I have to, since we're sharing, I have to share a picture. My favorite picture of my son. This is probably about 19 years old. Hold on, I'm going to put it up on the screen with our three-legged golden Barkley.
You had a disabled dog.
But I mean, is this not the cutest picture
That
ever?
is a gorgeous picture.
Right? Is that not the cutest picture, Patrick and
But
Bart?
isn't it, see, that's the thing. I can learn something from the animals. I had a blind dog that became blind when she was 7.
Yeah.
She just went around her life, about her life, and then when they can't jump anymore, they just look at me like, pick me up. I mean, they adjust.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Karen, this has been fun. Thank you so much. I know you have a website, karenbwinnick.com. We'll put that in the show notes. Also, we'll share your Instagram and Goodreads links as well.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. And Karen, all the best with this book and those 5 dogs.
Thank you.
Okay.
Have a great rest of the day.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to Uncorking a Story. If you'd like more information about today's guest or to find out more about Mike, go to uncorkingastory.com. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe, rate, and review us at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Tune in every week to hear Mike Carlin uncork a new story.